Welcome to week 2 in plant biology here at NICC. Last week for week 1, all you had to read simply was the introduction to the Biology 2E chapter 30, which is really the introduction just to the plants part of that textbook. There wasn't a lot of in-depth content or anything like that in that introduction, but I hope it gave you guys a chance to see kind of maybe where this semester is going. This week we start reading a little more intensively, and we'll be reading chapters 1 and chapter 2 of the Concepts of Biology textbook, also available as the OER. Chapter 1 really is an introduction to science. Biology and plant biology are just different subjects within the broader ideas of science, specifically biology for this class. And so it's important to have a basic understanding of how science works. And these sort of organizational systems that exist within scientific pursuits. Starting out in the chapter, we talk about the properties of life. So what makes a thing alive? That may seem like an obvious question at the start, but in many cases, it's not entirely clear. So when we're talking about biology, the things that we're talking about are alive, and they really lay out a pretty good framework for what determines whether something is alive or not alive. Talk a little bit about organization, so we can start at the smallest things we know and work on up to the biggest things. Starting out with atoms as the smallest, and then in a biological concept anyways, we can move all the way up to what's called the biosphere, which is all the life on the planet. Talk about diversity of life, so taxonomy. We'll be talking about taxonomy later in the semester, and taxonomy is really the organizational structure that scientists use to map out different organisms and where they fit evolutionarily and in family relationships with other organisms. So how closely are mushrooms related to plants? How closely are grasshoppers related to anteaters? Taxonomy is the naming system that scientists use to build those family relationships. And taxonomy is important for plants, especially because there's such a wide diversity of it. It's important to know how these things fit together with one another. The final main point in chapter 1 that they talk about is what's known as the nature of science, or the process of science. So the scientific method is something you guys have probably heard of, and whether you understand it or not is that's why we're taking this course, is to learn these things. So but understanding what the scientific method is, understanding that science is a way of knowing the world, in the same way that art or literature or religion are ways of knowing the world, science is simply just a different way to know the world. One of the advantages that science has as a way of knowing the world is that it's highly organized and has this system in place to develop our knowledge about the world that fits closely regardless of which sort of branch of science you're in. The process is much the same. Hypothesis testing is really important. A hypothesis is basically an educated guess that is testable, or a tentative explanation that is testable. And so those two components are things that make up hypotheses, and that's really a foundation for scientific investigation. The chapter then goes on to sort of flesh out the scientific process, or how it works in general terms. It's important to understand that the flow chart in figure 1.18 is a very good flow chart, but the reality is that when you're doing actual science, those arrows move all over the place instead of in this very clear linear downward sort of fashion. That kind of finishes up what chapter 1 is about. Again, introduction to science, introduction to biology, and laying that foundational groundwork for what we're going to be talking about throughout this semester. Chapter 2 is a little more in-depth. It begins a discussion about chemistry, and it's really difficult to have a meaningful discussion about biology if you don't at least have some basic knowledge about chemistry as well. The two are very closely linked. Biology is really just chemistry in action. The cells that our body is made up with are really just chemicals that are bound together in specific ways, and those specific ways are what drives the development of what we call life. So chapter 2 really starts out with the really basic elements of chemistry, and the basic elements of chemistry really are that, elements. These are these base materials that form the foundations to all of the things that we are made of. These small particles are called atoms. They have a proton, or they have protons, they have neutrons in the nucleus. They have electrons that swirl around this nucleus. The periodic table is a chart that you guys are probably at least somewhat familiar with that lays out all the elements that we know of and some that we don't even know of, but we can guess because that's the way it works, on a chart so that we can see these properties laid out with atoms that are similar, and then we can see how they're different from others as well. We talk about chemical bonds in this chapter. There are two main types of chemical bonds: ionic bonds and covalent bonds. Ionic bonds are weaker bonds. That's where you have electron donation between atoms, and you have covalent bonds where you have electron sharing. Now, a major difference between ionic bonds and covalent bonds is that ionic bonds tend to be very weak bonds. Those bonds that are put together separate very easily. If you think about sodium chloride or table salt dissolving in water, that's breaking apart ionic bonds. Covalent bonds are where you have these electrons shared between atoms, and they form these tight linkages between the atoms within these molecules. These covalent bonds are extremely tough. Water, H2O, those are covalent bonds. Carbon dioxide, CO2, covalent bonds. Really strong, tough bonds that really hold tight and are really difficult to break apart. We also talk about a different kind of bonding called hydrogen bonding, and that's where you have a molecule that's polar, so that means that one end of the molecule is sort of a positive charge and the other side of the molecule has a negative charge. Water is one of these polar molecules. And you have this attraction, just like magnets, positive and negative attract. Same thing happens with this hydrogen bonding, and you have these molecules lightly sticking together to one another because of this hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonds are fairly easy to break. If you think about water as an example, if you have a pot of water, that water is being held together by hydrogen bonds. If you add enough heat to that water, all that energy eventually breaks apart those hydrogen bonds and the water evaporates. They're easy bonds to break. But they're also in many ways strong bonds because there are so many of them that they hold together. And so if you pour water on the table, you see that sort of dome shape characteristic of a water drop on a table, that's held together because of hydrogen bonds. If those hydrogen bonds weren't holding together, that water would spread out one molecule thick across the whole table. But it doesn't do that. It forms up into these shapes because of hydrogen bonding. Water is a really important molecule to talk about when we're talking about biology. Without water, there really is no life. Water is this polar solvent that really reacts very nicely with biological chemicals in many different ways, and so it's really this sort of slushy stuff that fills all the spaces of our cells and really helps drive a lot of the chemistry that we see happening. I guess we've talked a little bit already about some of the properties of water, but water is also adhesive. That means it sticks to things. So if this is a, gotta get my hand right, there we go. So if this is say the cell wall or the tube within a plant, that water will stick to it and hold on. That's an important thing to understand, that water is sticky. If you have a glass with ice in it and you have condensation on the side, those drops, as they are on the side, stick to the side. That's the adhesive power of water. And again, that's really a hydrogen bonds at work. Water is also cohesive, and when something is cohesive, that means that it's sticking to itself. And again, when we're talking about water sticking together, that's cohesion. Another important property of water that we see it being critically important when we're talking about living systems. After we move past water, we start talking about buffers and pH and acids and bases. pH is really the measure of acidity in a solution. The pH scale runs from 0 to 14. 7 in the middle is neutral, so usually distilled water is right about neutral. Things that move to the acidic side, that's where pH gets lower. So low pH is acidic, high pH is basic. You are familiar with lots of different excuse me. You're familiar with lots of different acids and bases. Things like lemon juice, pop is acidic. Stomach acid, digestion, those are all acidic properties. Bases, maybe a little, you're also familiar with them, but probably a little less so. Ammonia, cleaning agent, is definitely is basic. Sodium hydroxide, so you probably know it under the brand name of Drano, is a very strong base, and both strong acids and strong bases are corrosive, so they break down other things. So if you're using strong acids and bases as cleaning agents or whatever, use caution. After talking about pH and buffers and stuff, we move on to biological molecules. So biological molecules are bigger molecules within biology that really start to add to the functionality of life. And the base element for these biological molecules is called carbon. You guys have heard about carbon, carbon nanotubes, carbon dioxide. Carbon is a critically important element for life. Carbon forms the foundation, skeleton, and frameworks of many of the biological molecules that we're going to be talking about. So carbohydrates, so sugars, structural carbohydrates like cellulose. So wood, paper is made up of cellulose. These are sugars that plants build together utilizing energy from the sun and build into these big complex molecules. Lipids are fats. Fats have critical roles in biology. A lot of times as steroids and chemical signals, structural components. Proteins, you guys have heard of protein. Protein is, I'd say, a little more common, I'd say, in animal systems, mostly because protein is what builds muscle. So if you're an organism with muscles, you have lots of protein in you. Proteins are also critical and found in all life because they form what are called enzymes. Enzymes are basically helpers of chemical reactions in the body. Proteins also form hormones, and they're really critical in the functioning of living systems. There are four structural steps when you're building a protein. It's important to go through and understand the primary structure, the secondary structure, the tertiary structure, the quaternary structure of proteins, at least in the general sense that this book talks about. The last group of biological molecules that the book talks about in this chapter are the nucleic acids, and nucleic acids are also critically important for life. Nucleic acids basically are DNA, RNA, and other nucleotides. DNA is the blueprint for all of life. It's the code that all life is written on. So without DNA, there really is no life as we know it on this planet. RNA is also important. It's what moves the code of DNA into the function of the proteins. We'll get to that when we get to that. But again, this is the introductory chapter for chemistry. If you have any questions, again, please put them out on the discussion board so that I can address them in a public way and everybody can learn from your questions. All right, I hope you guys have a great week. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you.